Thank you, Rupert. I wanted to ask you about existence and existing. You'd mentioned a couple of times this week that the word exist comes from the Latin existare, to stand out. On the other hand, I find that the easiest way for me to experience directly consciousness is with that Sanskrit word aham, which I take to mean the universal feeling of existence, in the sense that that's something that all 7 billion of us can agree to. But then, in the same way, you mentioned that when you talk about standing out, the bunch of flowers, if all 7 billion of us agree that that exists as well as a perception, why is this standing out a distraction? Or have I misunderstood what you're getting at?
Just to go back to the beginning of what you said about the word aham, which you translate as I exist, and you're right. We can translate that Sanskrit word as I exist. More accurately, it's translated as I am, or I am present. In other words, the existence part of I exist really refers to being. Existence means to exist or stand out of being. Very often the word existence is used to mean being. So I'm using the word existence I make a distinction between being and existence. Usually in philosophy they're used in the same way. So as long as existence is synonymous with being, then I have no problem with it. But the actual meaning of the word is to stand out from, and the idea is that it stands out from being. An object comes into existence. It stands out of infinite being and becomes a finite object. And as that finite object, it exists. So we say the flowers exist. We think that the flowers have their own being. We forget or overlook the fact that the being that seems to exist as the flowers belongs to God, to infinite being. It doesn't belong to the flowers. The flowers don't have their own existence. We say the flowers exist, the lights exist, the window exists. No, objects don't exist. They don't have existence. Existence is not a property of objects. It's not something that comes in and out when an object appears and disappears. The object borrows its apparent existence from God's infinite being. Just like when the movie begins, the landscape seems to come into existence. In other words, it seems to stand out from the screen, and as a result the screen seems to disappear. So now the landscape seems to have its own independent existence or reality, but in fact the existence of the landscape is borrowed from the presence of the screen, the being of the screen.
So all things seem but cannot be. Beauty brags, but 'tis not she.
Perfect. Yes. All things seem to have their own existence. And the words beauty in this context are used in a different context to the way I use them. Beauty brags. In this case, it's beauty means the attractive surface of the object. All things seem but cannot be. All things seem to have their own independent existence, but that cannot be. They seem, the appearance of the object, beauty brags, the object shines out. I am a separate object. I have my own existence. Beauty brags, but 'tis not she. The existence that seems to be in the object doesn't belong to the apparent object. It belongs to infinite consciousness. And the object is a temporary, the appearance of the finite object is a temporary modulation of the infinite background of pure being. It gives, the object gives pure being a temporary name and form. Because in the absence of the object, there is infinite being that has no name and form. It is transparent, it is empty. It is the appearance of the object that gives it name and form, nama-rupa. Hence nama-rupa, Satchitananda. Satchitananda, infinite being, infinite, inherently peaceful being, takes the shape of the object. The object gives it a temporary name and form, and when the name and form disappears, nothing real disappears. Just like the image in the movie gives the screen, the transparent screen, which is otherwise invisible within the limits of the metaphor. The image gives the screen a temporary name and form. It seems to be a landscape. But when the movie finishes, nothing real disappears. The reality of the landscape, the screen, remains. Its being remains. It's only its apparent existence disappears, and its reality then remains. So once that is clear to us, we can see the appearance, the flowers, the landscape, whatever it is, and discern in the appearance the reality. So when Huang Po said people ignore the reality of the illusory world, he meant people are seduced by beauty bragging. People are seduced by the appearance of objects, and we think there are only objects and selves. But once it's clear to us that all apparent objects are a modulation, a temporary modulation of this ever-present screen, then of this ever-present being, then this ever-present being, as it were, shines through the object. We can go back to the experience of thinking, feeling, imagining, seeing, tasting, hearing, etc. But all the objects are transparent to their origin. Pure knowing, pure consciousness. So then we no longer see objects as a veiling of God's infinite being. On the contrary, they then become an expression, a modulation of God's infinite being. Hence William Blake. Oh no, no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, glory, glory, glory is the Lord God Almighty. Everything shines primarily with its source. What he saw was not a collection of temporary finite objects. He saw God's infinite being, an innumerable company of the heavenly hosts. And what these objects spoke to him first and foremost, they told him about God's infinite being, rather than about the finite qualities of an object. It's in the Christian tradition, it's called the transfiguration, where objective experience becomes increasingly transparent to the light of awareness, until at a certain point all objective experience shines with the infinite light of awareness, or God's being.
Thank you, that's very revealing. Thanks. I'm going to stay with my mistranslation of a hum, because it's become a kind of a lock.
It's fine.
Rather,
no, stay with your mistranslation of a hum, because I'm just giving it a different translation. It's perfectly okay to translate it as I exist, as long as we understand that existence in this case is synonymous with being.
Thank you.
Incidentally, I'm also going to stay with my misquotation of Shakespeare. I was told recently by someone, and they actually showed me on the internet, and I'm afraid this is true, that Shakespeare didn't say that all things seem but cannot be, beauty brags but 'tis not she. I think I have subtly changed it over the years. I can't remember what he exactly what he did say, but I'm afraid I can no longer legitimately attribute it to Shakespeare, because he didn't quite say that. So it's my quote, inspired and informed by Shakespeare.
I've been wheeling that out as my Shakespeare quote for years too. So
oh, good. I'm glad we had the same interpretation of Shakespeare.